the really dramatic thing about this election. If the polls are correct, and I have no reason to believe they're not at the moment, the Conservatives are going to break the golden rule that you can put a parrot on a stick in British politics as leader of either of the two parties, and they will get around 29% of the vote in Great Britain.
We're joined now by Matthew Parris, the Times economist. Morning, Matthew.
Good morning.
Loads of people getting in touch this morning with us. I do sense a feeling that Sunak maybe did slightly better than expected, and Starmer did slightly worse than expected. Is a prevailing view, I think, of Times Radio listeners. What do you think of that?
I think that's absolutely right. I got the impression that Sunak kind of edged it because a lot of people, I think, thought there might be knockout blows from Keir Starmer. There really weren't. Sunak was pretty lucid. On the whole, he kept his temper. And on the whole, he was able to answer. I've always had a measure of admiration for Rishi Sunak, so I may not be the person to ask, but I think he had the edge over Keir Starmer this time, but neither of them scored any really knockout blows. They were both left standing at the end.
It strikes me that there were 2 or 3 areas where Starmer could have been more definitive and somehow wasn't. You know, that question of the £2,000 extra tax paid under Labour. His people outside and on social media were busy debunking that and slapping it down. He didn't really do that. He didn't answer that question about pensioners never having to pay tax on state pension under the Conservatives. He didn't really answer that. Didn't really answer the thing about the small boats either. I mean, maybe that's just his policy. And maybe this will work, Matthew. Maybe the sensible thing to do is show as little leg as possible, because that's what's going to get you into Downing Street.
I think that's right. I mean, on tax, his instinct is not to say too much and not to promise that he won't put it up, but because he can't really. And it was probably better not to get into the weeds of an argument about whether the figure 2,000 was right or wrong. On the other hand, I thought that Sunak rather lost the bout over NHS waiting lists. The fact is they were both right. NHS waiting lists are coming down at the moment, but they are still higher than when he said he would bring them down. And even if I were Sunak, I would simply have said, well, we're both right, and they are still much too high. You're not wrong about that, and I'm not happy about it, and I'm just carrying on battling to bring them down, and at the moment they do seem to be coming down. If he'd said that, I think people would have understood.
But they don't seem to want to do that. I mean, maybe this is a problem with the format. Like quite a lot of this morning, we've been discussing this, Matthew, this notion of if you put 2 people up against each other with 45 seconds and a moderator, you're just going to end up with shouty, talking over each other, which Sunak probably did better than Starmer. But is there something in the format here, Matthew, that needs to change if we really want to get something that's actually sensible and takes the issues forward?
No format, I think, will overcome the problem that the way we seem to do politics in Britain is that each will try to out-talk and out-shout the other, and neither will be prepared to concede any ground to the other. And if they're not, it doesn't matter what the format is, you're going to get a fairly unedifying result. Had Julie Etchingham simply stood back and let them go for it, as it were, I don't think we would have learnt anything more. There would still have been shouting. There would still have been Punch and Judy and Yabu. I thought she chaired it well, and I don't see what other format would have achieved any other result from the politicians that we have and from the kind of politics that we have.
And just on final on that thought, Matthew, is it not worth doing these? I mean, because they're a great triumph for democracy, everyone says, but I do understand that argument. The more you have access to your leaders, the better it is. I totally understand that as an argument in theory. But in practice, I just wonder whether we ever gain anything from all of this stuff. And maybe actually coarsens the public debate.
No, I think last night was worth it. I mean, we saw Keir Starmer for what I imagine he is, a perfectly decent person, perfectly capable of being Prime Minister, a little bit stodgy, a bit finger-wagging and scolding. I think people perhaps saw a somewhat better Sunak than they thought they were going to see, but he too had no very clear ringing answers. And if 2 men both wanting to be Prime Minister, neither of which has any clear, ringing answer as to what to do. If those two men go head to head, you're never going to get a very edifying result. But that's perhaps telling us something about the situation our country is in.
Yeah, which is undoubtedly the case. Matthew, great to speak to you. It's a really interesting piece in the paper today. That's Matthew Parris, the Times columnist.
Let's now speak to Ben Page, Chief Executive of Ipsos, the public opinions specialist. Good morning, Ben.
Good morning.
Now, going into the debate yesterday, just remind us, what were the personal ratings of these two men?
Well, both very negative, actually. I mean, I think Sunak's ratings have been similar in Ipsos polling to Jeremy Corbyn and Liz Truss. And Keir Starmer's ratings are well below the position that one would normally expect from a leader of the opposition who's about to win a general election. So they go in with relatively weak ratings, and politics as a whole at the moment in Britain is, not doing well with the public. Having said that, Sunak probably, for a man who is 20% behind in the polls, did better to achieve, a small advantage or a score draw last night. But there was no, I agree with Nick moment where, like 2010 with Nick Clegg, where he suddenly bursts onto the scene and everybody changes their mind for a few weeks.
Now, the debate covered a few important areas. Top three priorities for voters are health, the economy and immigration. Who do we know the public trust most on these issues?
Well, on every single one, actually, at the moment, Labour is ahead or narrowly ahead. So, and this is the really dramatic thing about this election. If the polls are correct, and I have no reason to believe they're not at the moment, the Conservatives are going to break the golden rule that you can put a parrot on a stick in British politics as leader of either of the two parties, and they will get around 29% of the vote in Great Britain. With the Conservatives currently polling, in the low 20s, this is amazing stuff. And most people who look at elections on a permanent basis would expect that the Conservatives would gradually narrow the gap, not win at this point. It's virtually impossible, but certainly narrow the gap. There were some signs that might happen last night, but on those issues, there is no cut-through issue. Immigration, of course, is one where the core Conservative vote, the over 65s, and you saw applause for Sunak there, does have an advantage. But there was not too much there. Sunak did land blows with the £2,000 tax cut that Starmer was slow to respond to. But again, this is not changing the weather.
Ben, thank you very much for that. That's Ben Page, Chief Executive of Ipsos, the public opinion specialist. Now, we kind of started the show by asking you what you would do with these debates if we have to have them. How should they be changed? Because it feels like, well, anyway, Times Radio listeners seem a bit frustrated by, it's not to do with who was hosting it, it's to do with the format. And that format is decided by, TV executives and producers. I don't know how much they speak to actual viewers before they decide on the format. And anyway, you've been suggesting what you would do instead. If you had to start with a blank sheet of paper, Kim says, politicians seem unable to debate because they have to spout their sound bites. 2 half-hour interviews with an incisive interviewer would have been far more informative. Neither Starmer nor Sunak were given sufficient time to correct falsehoods or explain themselves. Another one here from John. I found the debate infuriating. The leaders had nowhere near enough time to speak. These things just try to cover too many subjects, so they do it at a ridiculously high level. That's why Starmer could basically say nothing about what he would do as PM. Perhaps they should have 2 or 3 debates with different topics covered. There are going to be other debates, and they'll be different. Earlier on, Stig, I said that we were going to have a think about what we would do. And I don't have any great ideas, but here's a really stupid idea. Rishi Sunak interviews Keir Starmer for half an hour, and Keir Starmer interviews Rishi Sunak for half an hour. That's going to be all the journalists listening to it. No. We need to be in the room. Do you?
That'd be interesting.
I don't know,
That's a good
I'm
idea.
not sure.
I mean,
anyway, that's the kind of mad, stupid idea. Those are the kind of ideas we're looking for, because you need to engage people more, I think, don't you?
I actually think, though, they'd have to sort of hold on to the proprieties in some form or another, wouldn't they? I mean,
they would, but they'd probably have to do their research on each other, and they would, they would obviously have they'd have equal time. 30 minutes for you, 30 minutes for
Okay,
you. Anyway, that's my idea.
Asma's idea, which is clearly a really good one. Let's put the challenge out there. I know that people representing Keir Starmer and Rishi Sunak do listen to our breakfast programme. We would happily host that.
Oh.
An hour.
Yes, we would.
An hour on Times Radio. You interview each other
Yeah.
for the first half hour and reverse it for the second half hour. We would make that happen in a second. If you think that's a good idea, you're very welcome to come on Times Radio to do that. And keep your thoughts coming in on your ideas of how to do this and your thoughts on the state of politics and whether that leaders debate told you anything. The feeling is, as we go through it, as we said to Matthew Parris, that Sunak did do better than Starmer. But is that going to be enough? You just heard from a pollster saying probably not.